On a muddy field in France, the most powerful army in the world charged to its death, annihilated not by rival knights, but by an army of peasants. This is the story of how a simple piece of wood proved more powerful than 500 years of noble tradition, changing warfare forever. One army was a shining vision of chivalry, the collected might of European nobility clad in a king's ransom of steel. These were the French knights, the absolute masters of the medieval battlefield, the tanks of their day. For 500 years, the thunderous, earth-shaking charge of heavy cavalry had been the decisive force in European warfare. A fully armored knight on an armored warhorse was a one-ton weapon of shock and awe, a kinetic force that could shatter any infantry line. These men were bred for war, a warrior caste trained in combat from the moment they could walk. As pages, they learned courtly manners and service. As squires, they learned the brutal art of the lance, the sword, and the mace. As knights, they were living weapons, their lives dedicated to martial perfection and the complex code of chivalry. Their polished plate armor, a work of art from the master smiths of Milan or Augsburg, cost more than a peasant village earned in a lifetime. In their worldview, infantry existed to be trampled, and archers were a mere annoyance, commoners who fought from a distance, lacking the honor to meet a foe face to face. Real men, noble men, fought with swords on horseback, their superiority guaranteed by their noble blood and the blessing of God. The other army placed its faith in something the French openly despised: 5,000 Welsh and English longbowmen. These were not nobles, they were mostly peasants, yeomen, and even pardoned criminals who had practiced with their bows since childhood because English law required it. In a stroke of national strategic genius, the English monarchy had turned the entire countryside into a military academy. Every Sunday after church, by royal decree, all able-bodied English males had to practice archery. It was literally illegal to play other sports like football if you could be practicing with a bow. This law created a vast reservoir of expert archers, unlike anything else in Europe. The longbow itself was a deceptively simple weapon, a 6-foot stave of yew wood, nothing fancy. But in trained hands, it was devastating. These archers could loose 12, and some even 15, arrows per minute at a target 250 yards away. That is an arrow every 4 or 5 seconds, delivered with lethal accuracy across the length of 2.5 football fields. The draw weight was immense, between 150 and 180 pounds of force. To draw such a bow was a feat of incredible strength, a skill that could only be developed over a lifetime of constant practice. Archaeologists today can identify the skeletons of medieval longbowmen by their distinctive deformities. Their left arms were inches longer than their right, their shoulder blades were thickened, and their spines were often twisted from years of drawing that massive weight. This was the humble, asymmetrical power about to be pitted against the symmetrical perfection of the French knight, a weapon that could turn a peasant into a knight killer. But a weapon is useless without a strategy. And the English king's plan was so radical, so insulting to his own nobles, that it almost caused a mutiny before the battle even began. So why had these two completely different forces gathered on this muddy field? The answer was vengeance. The conflict that would become the 100 Years' War was a bitter dynastic struggle. The English king had a claim to the French throne, and to prove his rival's weakness, he had unleashed a campaign of pure terror across northern France. This chevauchée was licensed vandalism on a terrifying scale. For weeks, his army cut a scar of devastation across the rich Norman countryside. Villages were left as smoking ruins, their inhabitants fleeing with whatever they could carry. Centuries-old churches were looted, crops were set ablaze in the fields, and livestock was scattered or slaughtered. This was psychological warfare. Every burning farm was a message, every plundered town a declaration that the French king was powerless to protect his people. The English had just sacked the wealthy city of Caen and were now making a desperate run for the coast, trying to reach the safety of English-held Calais before the hammer of French vengeance fell. And that hammer was the most awe-inspiring army in Christendom. The French king had gathered a force that swelled to between 30,000 and 35,000 men. It was the ultimate expression of medieval power. Dukes whose lands were the size of small kingdoms rode alongside counts, barons, and knights. They were joined by allied kings and princes from across the continent. The Holy Roman Empire sent troops. The King of Majorca sent knights. And the aging, blind King John of Bohemia, a man considered the very paragon of chivalry, came with his entire court, eager to be present for the final, glorious victory. This was a medieval Avengers assembly, and they saw the English army for what it was, exhausted from weeks of raiding, low on supplies, cut off from escape, and outnumbered more than 3-1. The jaws of the wolf were closing. The English king's radical decision was this. He ordered his knights and men-at-arms, the pride of his kingdom, to step down from their horses and fight on foot. These men had trained their entire lives for the thunder of the charge, their war horses worth more than gold, their entire identity tied to the status of the mounted warrior. To be asked to stand in the mud, to plant their feet on the earth beside archers in wool hoods, was an unthinkable insult to centuries of tradition. A murmur of dissent ran through the noble ranks. But their king was a pragmatic and ruthless commander who understood something the French did not. The age of the mounted knight was ending. He forced the issue, reminding them that survival mattered more than pride. And so, for the first time in memory, the polished plate of English nobility stood shoulder to shoulder with peasant infantry, a sight no one in Christendom had ever seen. The English camp was a model of eerie calm and brutal efficiency. The king had carefully chosen his ground, a gently sloping hill near the village of Crecy, forcing the French to attack uphill into the setting Sunday. By torchlight, his men dug thousands of small pits, each a foot deep, designed to trip charging horses. They hammered sharpened stakes into the earth, angled towards the enemy, to impale the powerful war horses. The English turned the ground into a death trap, ready and waiting. But as the French army finally appeared on the horizon, a single, unforeseen act of nature threatened to make all their preparations worthless. If you enjoy learning about the moments that turned history on its head, make sure you subscribe to our channel for more stories of impossible victories and world-changing battles. Meanwhile, on the French side, it was chaos disguised as pageantry. The army arrived at the field around 4 o'clock in the afternoon, exhausted and strung out after a long, forced march. Nobles in gleaming, custom-made armor rode past one another, their silken banners snapping in the wind, each one more resplendent than the last. Dukes and counts squabbled openly and loudly about who would have the honor of leading the first charge, a privilege that promised the most glory. The French king's attempts to impose order were drowned out by the clamor of trumpets and boasts. His army looked less like a disciplined military force and more like a tournament gone mad. The smart move, the only sensible move, would have been to make camp, rest the men and horses, and attack with a clear plan the next morning. The king, not a fool, actually ordered a halt, but French nobility did not do patience. They saw the small English army on that hill, outnumbered and trapped, and they smelled glory. As they argued, the sky darkened. A sudden, violent thunderstorm erupted, unleashing a torrent of rain that soaked the field. The French knights laughed, their polished steel protecting them from the downpour. But for the missile troops, the rain was a catastrophe. The English, in a display of practiced discipline, calmly unstrung their bows, tucking the precious hemp strings under their helmets and cloaks to keep them dry. The Genoese crossbowmen in the French vanguard, mercenaries paid for their skill, had no such precaution. Their complex crossbows could not be easily unstrung, and their bowstrings were stretched and sagged in the damp, robbing them of their power and range. A tiny detail, a few moments of foresight, would decide the fate of thousands. The battle did not begin with a king's command or the sound of a trumpet. It began with the explosion of aristocratic pride, as a mob of nobles surged forward, dragging an entire army into a massacre. The French king, seeing the English calmly arrayed and waiting, again ordered his army to wait until the next day. But it was too late. Behind him, the great nobles pushed forward, shouting that the day was wasting and glory was slipping away. The king's command dissolved into dust. The French army was no longer an army. It was a wave of impatient aristocrats who refused to let discipline stand in the way of vanity. The vanguard ignored their king's orders and began to advance. First came the Genoese crossbowmen, about 5,000 of them, professional soldiers considered the best mercenary missile troops money could buy, but they were walking into a nightmare. Their large shields, called pavises, which they would normally hide behind while reloading their slow-firing weapons, were still miles back with the baggage train, and their crossbow strings were wet and slack from the rain. They advanced to about 150 yards extreme range for their weakened bows and fired a volley. Most of the heavy bolts fell short, plunging harmlessly into the muddy ground. Imagine being one of those English archers. You're a farmer from some forgotten village, not a soldier. In front of you is a mile of shining steel, the most terrifying force on earth, an army of aristocrats who believe they are a different species from you, ready to erase you from existence. All you have is your bow, the yew stick you've known your entire life, your training, and the muddy ground. And you are about to find out if it's enough. At a single command, 5,000 English longbows responded. Witnesses described the sound as being like a terrible thunder, a deep, tearing hiss that filled the air. The sky literally darkened with arrows. With each archer firing 12 arrows per minute, 60,000 arrows were falling on the Genoese every 60 seconds. The mercenaries had no shields, no cover, and their crossbows, which took up to 30 seconds to reload, were no match for the 5-second firing rate of the longbows. It was not a fight, it was an industrial, scale extermination. They were being deleted from existence. They broke and ran, streaming back toward the advancing French lines. And here, the battle descended into madness and atrocity. The French commander, the Count of Alençon, enraged at the sight of retreating commoners, shouted, "Kill me this rabble that blocks our way." The first line of French knights, in a frenzy of aristocratic fury, charged directly into their own crossbowmen, trampling and cutting them down. They murdered their own allies for the crime of not dying fast enough. The French knights had just murdered their own troops for blocking the path to glory. Now, it was their turn to charge. But they weren't charging towards victory. They were charging into a meticulously designed killing field that would turn their greatest strength, their war horses, into their biggest liability. Wave after wave of the most powerful and expensive cavalry in the world charged uphill, through the sucking mud, over the bodies of their own men, and straight into the teeth of the English arrow storm. At long range, the bodkin point arrows might not have penetrated the best plate armor, but they did not need to. They hit the horses. An armored warhorse was a massive target with numerous vulnerable spots, eyes, legs, and mouths. A 1,500-pound animal hit by multiple arrows does not continue to charge. It screams, rears, and falls, creating a 1,500-pound obstacle of thrashing, dying horseflesh. The charge lost all momentum before it even reached the English lines as knights crashed into fallen horses and each other, turning the glorious charge into a tangled, chaotic wreck. At closer range, under 100 yards, the arrows were devastating. Bodkin points, designed for penetration, could punch through mail and even weaker points in plate armor. They went through visors into faces, through the joints at the armpit and groin, through mail into thighs. Even hits that didn't penetrate were crippling, the sheer kinetic energy of the impact acting like a hammer blow, denting armor, breaking bones, and stunning the man inside. The French came in 16 separate, disorganized waves, each one climbing over the growing rampart of dead and dying men and horses from the previous charge. The English archers, with resupply arrows stuck in the ground before them for speed, kept up a continuous, terrifying fire. When they ran out of arrows, they simply walked forward into the field of slaughter, pulled arrows from the bodies of dead and dying Frenchmen, and fired them back. The French were being killed with their own recycled suffering. In the midst of this carnage, the blind King John of Bohemia provided the most insanely noble death in medieval history. 50 years old and blind for a decade, he had come to fight anyway, a living embodiment of chivalry. Hearing from his knights that the battle was utterly lost, he declared, "The King of Bohemia does not flee from a battle." He ordered his retainers to tie their horses' reins to his own, so they could lead him into the heart of the fight. He only wanted to strike one blow with his sword before he died. This blind king, tethered to his loyal knights, charged directly into the English lines, a small island of doomed courage in a sea of chaos, swinging his sword at sounds and shadows. He and all his attached knights were killed immediately. The English king's son, the Black Prince, was so moved by this display of pure, suicidal courage that he took the blind king's personal emblem, 3 ostrich feathers, with the motto Ich dien, I serve, which remains the symbol of the Prince of Wales to this day. What do you think was the blind king's charge, an act of ultimate honor or pointless vanity? Let us know in the comments below. As the sun set, the French king himself, wounded but unyielding, charged with the final wave. His horse was killed from under him, and an arrow pierced his jaw. His personal guard had to physically drag him from the field as he tried to return to the fight. The sacred oriflamme, the great battle banner of France that supposedly guaranteed victory, was lost, abandoned in the bloody mud. As dawn broke over the field at Crecy, the silence was more terrifying than the battle itself. It was the silence of a world that had been fundamentally broken. The English, shocked and exhausted by their own impossible success, had stayed in their positions all night, using long knives and hammers to finish off any wounded knights they found trapped in the mud under the weight of their armor and dead horses. When the morning mist cleared to reveal the full scale of the slaughter, even they could not believe it. The cream of French nobility lay dead in tangled heaps. The Count of Flanders, the Duke of Lorraine, the Count of Blois, the list went on and on. 1,500 nobles and 11 princes were dead, along with thousands of lesser knights and common soldiers. The English losses were estimated to be around 40 men, perhaps as high as 100, including only 2 knights. The disparity was so extreme, so beyond comprehension, that contemporary chroniclers claimed it could only have been an act of God. But the reality was simpler and far more terrifying for the old order. The longbow had made heavy cavalry obsolete in a single afternoon. If you found this moment in history as shocking as we did, share this story with someone who needs to know about it. But what died at Crecy was not just an army, it was an idea. For 500 years, European society had been built on a feudal contract. The nobility fought and ruled, and the commoners worked. The system was justified by the belief that being a knight meant being militarily superior. Noble blood, blessed by God, made you a better, more valiant, more effective warrior. Crecy proved that this was a lie. It proved that a Welsh peasant with a yew stick and a lifetime of practice could kill a duke just as dead as another knight. It proved that military superiority came not from bloodlines, but from technology, discipline, and tactics. The psychological impact on European nobility was shattering. The shockwave of the news rippled through the great castles of France as word arrived that entire noble families, entire lineages, had been wiped from existence in a few hours. The aftermath on the field was grotesque. Bodies lay rotting in the summer sun for days. Local peasants who had cowered during the chevauchée now crept onto the battlefield to loot the noble corpses, finding enough wealth in a single afternoon to transform their lives. Armor that could not save its wearer was stripped and sold. The crows and wolves that feasted on princely flesh grew so fat that locals reported they could barely fly, hopping from corpse to corpse too bloated to take wing. It was the perfect metaphor. Even the scavengers were overwhelmed by the death of so much nobility. In the end, the Battle of Crecy wasn't won by a king or a knight. It was won by a law that forced peasants to practice with a yew stick every Sunday after church. The romance of medieval combat died in the mud, and a new kind of warfare, one dominated by positioning, preparation, and firepower rather than individual courage, was born. Yet France did not learn immediately. 10 years later, at the Battle of Poitiers, they repeated the mistake, charging English archers positioned on a hill with the exact same result, losing another king and thousands more nobles. Today, a small monument marks the field at Crecy. Tour buses rarely stop. Most people have never heard of it. But on that muddy slope, the English didn't just win a battle. They proved that history is not always written by men in shining armor, but sometimes by the quiet, disciplined practice of ordinary people who were about to change the world. If you want to see more stories about the incredible battles that shaped our world, make sure to like this video and subscribe to our channel. and let us know in the comments what piece of history you think deserves to be told next.